We are featuring this hour an interview with Dr. Christopher Busby, an expert on radiation in Fukushima, who has been very outspoken about the dangers of even low levels of ionizing radiation from not just the Fukushima disaster, but other radiological events. And he joins us by Skype now to give us the latest breakdown on radiological weapons, a little bit of update on Fukushima, and some thyroid problems in children, a few other points as well. Welcome to the show, Dr. Busby.
Yes, hello. I'm talking to you from Riga. I headed off to the woods, and I'm now in the woods in my little house in Latvia.
Oh, really?
And what I want to talk to you about, really, I mean, it's my main thing, but I'll just plug it again, is what I see as and what actually is the biggest human health public health scandal of all time, which is this release to the environment by scientists since 1945 of all these radioactive substances like strontium-90 and plutonium-239 and cesium-137 and all that. And this whole umbrella of this radiological public health scandal covers all of the things that I've researched in the last 20 years. Fukushima, Chernobyl, nuclear increases in childhood cancer near nuclear sites, contaminated sea. We've done work on the Baltic Sea, on the Irish Sea, and most recently, of course, I've been involved in looking at depleted uranium and even some kind of new enriched uranium weapon which has been deployed by the Israelis in Lebanon and also in Fallujah, as we found out and published in the literature. So it's made me public enemy number one, of course, amongst the people who plug nuclear power stations.
Well, I'm sure. But if you look at the sources of all this, so you're talking about not only nuclear power, but nuclear weapons testing, obviously. Do you get into nuclear medical exposure?
Well, nuclear medical exposure is mostly external, and this is, and I think it's quite relevant for me to point out that it's not about low-level radiation. The argument is not about low-level radiation. It's about external and internal radiation, because actually radiation is measured in various units, millisieverts and millirads, and these units relate to energy that's transferred to the human body. So it's a physics-based unit that is used. And the big problem is that it doesn't work for internal radionuclides. And I can briefly explain why. The transfer of external energy, like gamma rays, into the body is the same as sitting in front of the fire and heating yourself and warming yourself up. You can get so many joules per kilogram of your body in terms of heat energy. But you could get the same number of joules per kilogram into your body if you reached into the fire and you ate a hot coal. And that's a very reasonable analogy, but the difference between standing somewhere where the radioactivity level is slightly higher, so you've got external radiation like from an X-ray machine or something like that, which is actually not, it may be low-level radiation, but it's not a big deal. But then ingesting or inhaling radioactive iodine, like for instance from Fukushima, or particles of depleted uranium from some weaponized use in Iraq, those things, those tiny particles and the internal radionuclides that damage the DNA, they are the serious problem, and that is the biggest public health scandal of all time. So, and yes, sorry.
I just wanted to ask you the question. Yeah. So externally, the radioactive particles, you are subject to them via the inverse square law of distance,
exactly.
right?
So just like sitting in front of a light. Yeah.
Right. But then internally, your distance to the particle is zero.
Absolutely so. And a lot of these particles are alpha emitters too, which normally an alpha particle wouldn't pass through your skin. But uranium, for example, plutonium, they're alpha emitters, and they're sitting inside you, and so they only have a very short range, and they produce enormous local doses to cells. So it isn't at all low-level radiation. But the con is this, that the nuclear industry, or in fact the military who started this way back in the 50s, the con is that they dilute all of that energy into the whole body, whereas actually the energy is all in one place, usually on the DNA. Yeah. This is outrageous.
Well, in terms of internal sources, this is fascinating. I've got a lot of questions for you already, but in your assessment, is it a higher risk of internal exposure through inhalation of airborne particles, or is it through eating food
No, it's more. It is more from inhalation. And the reason is quite simple: that over evolutionary timescales, the gut has found ways of excluding a lot of these radionuclides, because there are a lot of natural radionuclides like radium and uranium, thorium, and daughters of these substances, which occur naturally. And the gut seems to be quite clever at keeping a lot of this stuff out. But if it's inhaled, it gets into the lungs. It goes through the lungs into the tracheobronchial lymph nodes, and then the lymphatic system can take it anywhere. And in particular, where it takes it is to the female breast, because that's quite close by. And so these particles get into the female breast. So we find high levels of breast cancer in people who live downwind or close to nuclear power stations, for example. I mean, there's an awful lot of hoo-ha about childhood leukemia near nuclear power stations. But nobody's been looking at adults who live near nuclear power stations for the simple reason that the cancer registries refuse to release the data. So we've had to knock on doors in order to do these studies. So
which radiological isotopes are more likely to be airborne? For example, downwind from Fukushima, is someone likely to inhale a particle of cesium?
No, uranium.
Just uranium.
All of the effects in Iraq are a consequence of the use of uranium weapons. I don't say depleted uranium weapons, because we've actually measured this stuff, and we found that since about 2003, since the second Gulf War, that they've been using ordinary uranium, or even slightly enriched uranium, which is something which is a bit odd, which we don't quite understand. And it may well be, and I've suggested this, a consequence of a new type of weapon, which is a fusion weapon. But I mean, whether that's true or not, certainly uranium is the thing that is causing the effects in Iraq. And my feeling is probably uranium particles are what causes the effects downwind of nuclear power stations, because at the end of the day, uranium is what they run on. Uranium is what they run on. I mean, I've done a number of studies, for example, up in America, around near Los Angeles, around the Santa Susana site there, the field laboratory, where people are all dying like flies all around there, and nobody seems to figure out how it works. But if you look through the data, if you look through the environmental reports of Boeing and Rocketdyne, who are the people who run the operation, you find that there's enormous amounts of enriched uranium in the air filters. But nobody looks at uranium because it's kind of thought to be natural and somehow therefore safe. But of course, the particularized version of it is certainly not natural, and it's certainly not safe.
What isotopes of uranium are likely to be airborne, and what kind of half-life are we talking about there?
Well, the half-life is 4.7 billion years. I mean,
that's a little more than a human lifespan. Yeah,
that's kind of quite a long time. The uranium. In fact, uranium is the problem that they have when they try to bury nuclear waste. I mean, another study that I've done is to look at the Swedish proposals to build a nuclear waste site underneath the Baltic Sea, which is already the most radioactive sea in the world. And by the time all of the other radionuclides like cesium and strontium and all the short-lived stuff has gone away, the uranium and the radium is still there, because those things have enormously long half-life. They have geological half-lives. Mm-hmm. But of course, the particles won't stay there forever. The particles are produced when the weapons are used, and they go up in the air, and then they land in the desert, and they hang around for quite a long time. And my feeling, they still are there. I was in Iraq in 2001. I went there with Al Jazeera, a lot of measuring equipment and everything, and I found a lot of depleted uranium particles there from the first Gulf War. So that was like 10 years later, yeah.
Well, we also see in the veterans who are around the DU weapons, they are exhibiting very high rates of cancer, and I think you even mentioned...
That's true. Yes, I've done some studies. I've been called in as an expert recently on a number of United Kingdom veterans who were deployed in the second Gulf War and the first Gulf War, and they were basically cleaning out vehicles that had been struck by depleted uranium bullets, and they've got lymphomas, and they've got colon cancer too. And there are two of them with colon cancer, and the odds against that happening, I can tell you, at the age, because they're both 40, at that age, the odds against both of them getting colon cancer is 1 in 780,000. That's the lifetime odds. So it's quite obviously the uranium that's caused the colon cancer. But the government and the military, they just refuse to concede all of this stuff, and it's impossible to do any research because the cancer registries won't release the data.
Right. This is a global cover-up, but it's also easy to sweep under the rug because so many of the symptoms of radiological poisoning are they can be diagnosed as something different, and the symptoms can take a long time to be diagnosable.
Well, that's the main problem. It's like stabbing somebody and then they die 20 years later.
Right.
And so it's quite hard to do those sorts of cases. But it's not. It's getting easier, I have to say. The problem also, of course, is this. That in the last 10 years we've realized a lot more about the way in which there's been a lot of research done, and this hasn't fed through into the people who regulate the limits and so on. But anyway, what we've found out is that radiation doesn't just give you cancer, it gives you heart attacks, it damages your children, it more or less increases the rate of just about every illness that there is. So it's a kind of premature aging.
Yeah, like a stealth epidemic.
Yeah. So if you're looking, I mean, for instance, if you want to do a study and you look for increases in cancer, you won't only find increases in cancer, and because of that, you don't find as high an increase in cancer as you might predict. And the reason is that people die of something else before they get cancer. Cancer's an old age. It's something that increases exponentially with age.
We are going to take a quick break. Here's my question. It seems like the defense industry, or the weapons industry, let's call it, has a very deeply vested interest in protecting its investment in nuclear products and also the nuclear power industry. So you've got these two very powerful industries that want this truth to remain a secret, it seems, and it seems like you're knocking heads with these two industries quite frequently.
Yes, that's right. Actually, in the 50s is when it really got bad, and that's when it all started, because they wanted to, like as you say, they wanted to test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and it was quickly becoming apparent that this was killing people. So what they did was that they forced all of this information underground, and by 1959 there was an agreement between the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, whereby all of the research into this, the health effects of radiation, of the type of radiation I'm talking about, was put into the hands of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, I also, and this still goes on, because I was in Brussels talking about we've made a petition. Incidentally, there is something that people can do about this. So we have a website which we set up last year called nuclearjustice.org. We formed an international committee for nuclear justice in Vilnius, Lithuania. And so this is people can get in touch with us. There are petitions that can be used based on human rights. Anyway, my point is, I went to Brussels to make an intervention on behalf of the Green Group of the European Parliament. And I was talking about this whole issue, and what I learned there was that the new radiation protection legislation, which is going through, which I was asked to go and talk about, is going to be put in the hands of the people who are in the hands of the industry rather than the hands of the Environment Committee, because they have these different committees in the European Union, and they have a committee that's involved in environment and health, and they have another committee that's involved, or directorate that's involved in looking after industry. So it's the industry committee who's going to be dealing with the legislation relating to radiation. And this is exactly like it happened in the 50s, where they gave the protection of human beings and the protection of the environment into the hands of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Right, and turn it over to the very people who are the problem.
Exactly. But you know, I mean, I was very interested earlier in your list of, and I quite went along with a lot of that stuff. You know, what I would call the Sovietization of the planet, actually.
Yeah.
Because although the Soviet Union has collapsed, all of the things that the Soviet Union went in for, all of this airbrushing of history and the teaching of nonsense and all the things that you talk about have now become mainstream in the United States and certainly in my country, in England as well too. So right. You really, basically, if you want to learn something, you go to the internet, and then you just have to kind of sift through all the crazy stuff. But basically, you get a much better idea of what's going on than if you listen to the news or if you look in the newspaper.
Well, I think that this nuclear industry this is a classic example of where they are attempting to destroy actual knowledge, destroy history, and spoon-feed you a new narrative that is at odds with physical reality, or in this case, actual physics.
Yeah, well, the thing, I've thought a lot about this, and I've concluded because you have to either think, well, they're just bad people or evil or something, and you then have to think, how can they possibly go in for all of this nonsense? So and then you can say, well, they might have a lot of money, people give them money in brown envelopes and all this, and there's probably a bit of that happens as well. But my feeling is that it's a way of looking at the world, and this way of looking at the world arrived in the last